Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight, we'll be exploring a forgotten chapter of ancient life, one that still echoes softly through time. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? Are you hearing this as the sun rises? Or are you, like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime? If the idea of gentle stories from long ago helps ease your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us just beyond the veil of sleep. What happens next is something so horrifying, so systematically cruel, that it seems almost impossible to believe. But this is the story of medieval Europe's leper colonies, and how an entire civilization dealt with its most feared outcasts. The medieval world had a unique way of handling those afflicted with Hansen's disease, what they called leprosy. They didn't just isolate these people, they erased them from existence entirely. The church developed an elaborate ritual called the Mass of Separation, where the afflicted person would be brought to the local cemetery, forced to kneel beside a freshly dug grave and have dirt thrown over their feet while a priest read the burial service. From that moment forward, they were considered dead to the world, dead to their families, dead to their communities, dead to God himself, or so they believed. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating and heartbreaking at the same time. These legally dead individuals had to continue living. They had to eat, sleep, find shelter, and somehow survive in a world that had officially declared them non-existent. And so, on the edges of medieval towns and cities, entire communities began to form. Communities of the living dead. Let me tell you about Marguerite of Normandy, a woman whose story illustrates just how quickly someone's entire world could collapse. Marguerite lived in the prosperous town of Rouen in the year 1247. She was married to a successful cloth merchant, had 3 young children, and lived in one of the finest houses on her street. Her life was everything a medieval woman could hope for. Then came the lesions. At first, they were barely noticeable, small discolored patches on her hands that she could easily hide beneath her sleeves. But leprosy doesn't stay hidden for long. The disease progresses relentlessly, and within months, the telltale signs became impossible to conceal. Her neighbors began to whisper. Her husband's business partners started making excuses to avoid their home. The local priest was summoned. The examination was swift and merciless. Medieval physicians had developed a series of tests to diagnose leprosy, and Marguerite failed every single one. They pricked her skin with needles, and she felt nothing. They held burning coals near her hands and she couldn't sense the heat. Her fate was sealed. The Mass of Separation took place on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Marguerite's husband, her children, her friends and her neighbors all gathered in the cemetery to watch her die while still breathing. The priest intoned the terrible words, "Be dead to the world, but alive again to God." Dirt was thrown over her feet. Her marriage was dissolved. Her property was seized. Her children were told their mother no longer existed. But Marguerite was still very much alive, and now she faced a terrifying question. What happens to someone who has been declared dead but still needs to eat, sleep, and survive? The answer lay 3 miles outside of Rouen, in a place called the Maladrerie de Saint-Julien. This was one of hundreds of leper colonies that dotted the European landscape during the medieval period, and it would become Marguerite's new home for the rest of her life. These colonies, known as lazarettos or maladreries, were unlike anything else in medieval society. They were simultaneously places of exile and sanctuary, punishment and mercy, despair and hope. The church, which had orchestrated the cruel ritual of social death, also provided the only means of survival for those it had condemned. Walking into a medieval leper colony was like entering a parallel universe. Here, the normal rules of society were turned completely upside down. People who had once been merchants, nobles, peasants, and craftsmen now lived together in a strange equality of suffering. Former enemies found themselves sharing the same crude shelters. Wealthy individuals who had once commanded servants now depended on the charity of others for their daily bread. The physical layout of these colonies was deliberately designed to reinforce the separation between the living and the legally dead. High walls surrounded the settlement, with gates that were locked at sunset and opened only at dawn. The buildings themselves were simple, often crude structures made of wood and stone, designed more for basic shelter than comfort. There were dormitories for sleeping, a chapel for prayer, a refectory for meals, and workshops where residents could perform simple tasks to contribute to the community's survival. But what made these places truly remarkable wasn't their physical structure. It was the complex social world that developed within their walls. Take the story of Brother Thomas, a former knight who arrived at the leper colony of Saint-Lazare in Paris sometime around 1289. Thomas had once been a man of considerable importance. He owned vast estates in the Loire Valley, commanded dozens of soldiers, and had fought in 3 different crusades. His diagnosis came during what should have been the prime of his life, at age 35, when a battle wound refused to heal properly and began showing the characteristic signs of leprosy. Like Marguerite, Thomas underwent the massive separation. Unlike her, however, he chose to view his exile not as a punishment, but as a calling. When he arrived at Saint-Lazare, he discovered a community in chaos. The previous master had died weeks earlier, and without strong leadership, the colony was struggling with everything from food distribution to maintaining basic sanitation. Thomas stepped into this void with the same organizational skills he had once used to command armies. He established work schedules, created a system for fairly distributing food and supplies, and most importantly, he instituted a code of conduct that gave dignity and purpose to people who had been stripped of both. Under Thomas's leadership, Saint-Lazare became something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a functioning democracy of outcasts. Residents elected representatives to handle disputes, make decisions about resource allocation, and plan for the community's future. They developed their own currency system, their own courts, and their own traditions. The workshops became centers of innovation rather than mere busy work. Residents who had once been blacksmiths, weavers, and carpenters began training others in their trades. They produced goods that were actually in demand in the outside world, creating a small but steady stream of income for the community. Most remarkably, they began to develop new techniques and tools specifically designed to accommodate the physical limitations that leprosy imposed. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval leper colonies. They became unlikely centers of medical innovation. When the outside world offered no hope of treatment or cure, the residents of these communities began experimenting with their own remedies and adaptive technologies. At the colony of Sherborne in England, residents developed a sophisticated system of wound care that was actually more advanced than what most physicians were practicing in the outside world. They created specialized tools for people who had lost the use of their fingers, designed clothing that could be easily put on and removed by those with limited dexterity, and even developed a form of sign language for residents who had lost the ability to speak clearly. The irony was striking. People who had been cast out of society as medically hopeless were actually pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge in ways that wouldn't be matched by mainstream medicine for centuries. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of life in these colonies was how residents maintained their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. They fell in love, formed deep friendships, created art, wrote poetry, and found ways to celebrate life even in the midst of unimaginable hardship. Consider the story of Eleanor and Marcus, two residents of a leper colony near Milan in the early 14th century. Elena had been a seamstress before her diagnosis, while Marcus had worked as a scribe. Both had lost everything when they were declared legally dead, but within the walls of their colony, they found each other. Their courtship was unlike anything you might imagine in the medieval world. Since they were legally dead, they couldn't marry in any official sense. But the community developed its own marriage rituals, its own ways of celebrating love and commitment. Elena and Marcus exchanged vows in the colony's small chapel, with their fellow outcasts serving as witnesses. They shared a tiny room in one of the dormitories and worked together in the colony's scriptorium, copying manuscripts that would be sold to support the community. When Elena fell ill with fever 3 months after their unofficial wedding, Marcus refused to leave her side. In the outside world, such devotion between spouses was considered admirable, but hardly remarkable. But here, in a place where love was supposed to be impossible, where hope was meant to die, Marcus's vigil became something sacred. He read to her from the manuscripts they had copied together, fed her broth with a wooden spoon he had carved himself, and held her hand through the long nights when the pain was worst. Elena recovered, but their story reveals something profound about these communities. Love didn't just survive in the leper colonies. In many ways, it flourished more purely than it did in the outside world, stripped of the complications of property, inheritance, and social status that dominated medieval marriages. The daily rhythm of life in these colonies followed patterns that would seem almost monastic to outside observers. Dawn brought the ringing of a small bell, calling residents to morning prayers in the chapel. But these weren't the elaborate rituals of cathedral worship. These were intimate gatherings of people who had been told God had abandoned them, yet who continued to believe in divine mercy. After prayers came the distribution of the day's rations. Food was always scarce, but the colonies developed remarkably sophisticated systems for ensuring everyone received their share. At the Maladrerie de Boigny near Orléans, residents used a complex rotation system where different people were responsible for food distribution each week, preventing favoritism and ensuring accountability. The morning meal was typically a thin gruel made from whatever grains the colony could afford, sometimes supplemented with vegetables grown in small gardens within the walls. Meat was a rare luxury, usually appearing only on religious feast days, or when a benefactor made a particularly generous donation. After breakfast, residents dispersed to their various tasks. Some worked in the workshops, others tended the gardens, maintained the buildings, or cared for those too ill to work. But perhaps the most important job belonged to the questors, the brave souls who ventured outside the colony walls to collect alms. This brings us to one of the most haunting aspects of medieval leper colonies: the relationship between the living dead and the world that had cast them out. Questors were required to follow strict protocols when they left the colony. They had to carry wooden clappers or small bells to announce their presence, ensuring that healthy people could avoid contact. They wore distinctive clothing, often including gloves to hide their hands and hoods to conceal their faces. Most importantly, they carried long-handled collection boxes, allowing donors to give alms without coming too close. The psychology of these encounters was complex and often contradictory. Medieval Christians believed that giving alms to lepers was one of the most meritorious acts possible, a direct path to salvation. Yet they also believed that physical contact with these same people could lead to contamination and death. This created a strange dance of charity and revulsion, where coins would be thrown from windows, bread left on doorsteps, and donations made at arm's length. Brother Antoine was one of the most successful questors at the colony of Saint-Ladre near Reims. Before his diagnosis, he had been a travelling merchant with a gift for persuasion and an understanding of human nature. These skills served him well in his new role, though the context was heartbreakingly different. Antoine developed an almost theatrical approach to his begging rounds. He would position himself near church entrances during Sunday services, timing his arrival for maximum impact. As wealthy parishioners emerged, feeling virtuous after hearing sermons about Christian charity, Antoine would ring his bell and call out in a voice that carried just enough suffering to touch hearts without causing too much discomfort. But Antoine's real genius lay in his ability to tell stories. He would share carefully crafted tales about life in the colony, about residents who were struggling, about small improvements that could be made with just a little more support. He understood that people wanted to feel their donations were making a specific difference, not just disappearing into a general fund for the unworthy. Over the course of 5 years, Antoine's efforts helped transform his colony from a barely surviving settlement into one of the most prosperous leper communities in northern France. They were able to improve their buildings, expand their workshops, and even establish a small library where residents could continue their education. Yet Antoine's success came at a personal cost that illustrates the psychological toll of life as one of the legally dead. Every day, he had to perform his own social death, reminding the world that he was dangerous, contaminated, worthy of pity, but not of human connection. He became expert at reading the expressions of the people he encountered. The quick averting of eyes, the involuntary step backward, the mix of fear and disgust that crossed faces when his bell announced his presence. Some donors were genuinely kind, speaking gentle words of encouragement from their safe distance. Others treated him as little more than a vessel for their own spiritual advancement, tossing coins without acknowledgement or thanks. The worst were those who seemed to take pleasure in his degradation, making him perform elaborate displays of gratitude for meager donations. Despite these humiliations, Antoine never lost sight of his purpose. He understood that his work wasn't just about collecting money. He was the face of his community, the bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the legally dead. Through his efforts, the outside world was reminded that the people in the colonies were still human, still deserving of basic compassion. The relationship between leper colonies and the broader community was further complicated by the economic realities of medieval life. While the church preached charity toward lepers, the practical management of these colonies required significant resources that often strained local budgets. Many colonies survived only through a complex web of patronage that involved noble families, wealthy merchants, and church hierarchies. The colony of La Madeleine near Toulouse provides a fascinating example of how these economic relationships worked. Established in 1178 by a wealthy cloth merchant named Guillaume de Montpellier, the colony was initially well-funded and able to provide comfortable accommodations for its residents. Guillaume's motivation was partly religious, partly practical. His own brother had been diagnosed with leprosy, and Guillaume wanted to ensure he would have a decent place to live out his remaining years. But Guillaume's generosity created an unexpected problem. As word spread about the relatively comfortable conditions at La Madeleine, more and more people sought admission. The colony's population grew from 12 residents to over 60 within a decade. The original endowment, generous as it was, couldn't support so many people at the standard Guillaume had envisioned. This led to a series of difficult decisions that reveal the harsh realities beneath the surface of medieval charity. The colony's administrators implemented an admissions system based partly on ability to pay. Wealthy lepers could essentially buy their way into better accommodations, while the poor were relegated to more basic quarters. Some residents were required to turn over their remaining possessions to the colony in exchange for lifetime care. These arrangements created their own hierarchies within the colony walls. Former nobles and wealthy merchants found themselves in positions of authority, while peasants and labourers occupied the bottom rungs of the social ladder, much as they had in the outside world. The legal death that was supposed to erase social distinctions often merely recreated them in miniature. Yet even within these constraints, remarkable stories of human resilience and ingenuity continued to emerge. Take the case of Master Jean, a former university scholar who arrived at La Madeleine in 1203. Jean, had been working on a treatise about astronomy when his diagnosis forced him to abandon his academic career. Rather than wallowing in despair, he decided to continue his scholarly, Jean-established work within the colony. What was essentially the first school for lepers in medieval Europe. He taught reading and writing to residents who had never had the opportunity to learn, shared his knowledge of mathematics and natural philosophy, and encouraged others to pursue intellectual interests. His little school became so renowned that healthy scholars occasionally sought permission to visit and exchange ideas. The irony wasn't lost on Jean that he was able to pursue learning more freely as a legally dead leper than he had ever been able to do as a living scholar. Free from the political pressures and religious constraints that dominated university life, he could explore ideas that would have been considered dangerous or heretical in mainstream academic circles. The intellectual freedom that Jean discovered within the walls of La Madeleine wasn't unique to his situation. Across Europe, leper colonies were becoming unexpected havens for ideas that couldn't flourish in the rigid structures of medieval society. But this freedom came with a price that few could have anticipated. Consider what happened at the colony of Saint-Gilles in southern France during the winter of 1298. The residents had developed something that would have been impossible in the outside world. A system of democratic governance that gave equal voice to former serfs and former lords. They held weekly assemblies where every resident, regardless of their previous social status, could propose solutions to community problems. This sounds almost utopian until you understand the context. These assemblies weren't born from noble ideals about equality. They emerged from pure necessity. When you're slowly dying from a disease that the world believes is divine punishment, traditional hierarchies become meaningless. A former count whose hands are too damaged to hold a quill needs the help of a former peasant who still retains his dexterity. A former merchant's knowledge of trade becomes useless when a former blacksmith's ability to repair tools means the difference between eating and starving. The winter of 1298 was particularly harsh, and Saint-Gilles faced a crisis that would test everything they had built. Their main benefactor, a wealthy abbey, had suffered its own financial difficulties and could no longer provide regular support. Food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Several residents had died not from leprosy, but from simple starvation. The colony's leader, a former knight named Bertrand, called an emergency assembly. What happened next reveals both the remarkable resilience and the heartbreaking desperation of these communities. The residents voted to do something that violated every principle of medieval charity. They would take what they needed to survive. Under cover of darkness, small groups began venturing beyond their walls to raid vegetable stores, granaries, and even homes in nearby villages. They weren't random acts of violence or greed. These were carefully planned operations led by people who had once been responsible citizens, now driven to banditry by circumstances beyond their control. The moral complexity of these raids haunted everyone involved. Brother Claude, a former monk who participated in several of these nocturnal expeditions, later wrote about the experience in a journal that survived in the colony's archives. His words capture the anguish of people forced to choose between death and dishonor. We who were once the recipients of charity have become thieves in the night. Yet when I see little Marie, barely 12 years old and already showing the signs of the disease, growing thinner each day, I cannot find it in my heart to repent. The raids continued for 3 months, and remarkably, they were largely successful. The residents of Saint-Gilles managed to acquire enough food and supplies to survive the winter. But their actions had consequences that extended far beyond their own survival. Word of the raids spread throughout the region, and the response was swift and brutal. Local authorities, already suspicious of leper colonies, used these incidents as justification for imposing much harsher restrictions on all such communities. New laws required colonies to maintain smaller populations, to submit to regular inspections, and to accept appointed overseers who weren't residents themselves. More devastatingly, public sympathy for lepers, already limited, began to evaporate entirely. donations dropped dramatically across the region. Other colonies found themselves struggling not just with disease and poverty, but with active hostility from their neighbours. The story of Saint-Gilles illustrates one of the most tragic aspects of medieval leper colonies: how desperation could transform victims into villains in the eyes of a society that had already abandoned them. But it also reveals something profound about human nature under extreme circumstances. When spring arrived and the immediate crisis had passed, the residents of Saint-Gilles made a remarkable decision. They voted to make restitution for everything they had taken during the winter raids. Over the course of the following year, they worked extra hours in their workshops, took on additional labour for local farmers, and gradually paid back every stolen item. This act of collective repentance wasn't motivated by legal pressure or external demands. The authorities had no way to force compliance, and the victims of the raids had little recourse against people who were legally dead. Instead, it came from an internal moral compass that had somehow survived intact, despite everything these people had endured. The process of making restitution became a defining moment for the colony. Residents who had never worked together before found themselves collaborating on complex projects. Former rivals discovered common ground in their shared commitment to restoring their community's honour. Most importantly, they began to see themselves not as helpless victims of divine punishment, but as moral agents capable of making choices about who they wanted to be. This transformation had practical benefits as well. As word spread about Saint-Gilles' efforts to make amends, public opinion began to shift. Donations slowly resumed. Local authorities eased some of the restrictions they only survived, but had imposed. The colony not to thrive in ways it never had before. The success of Saint-Gilles inspired similar transformations at other colonies across France and beyond. At Sherborne Hospital in England, residents established what was essentially the first consumer protection system in medieval Europe. They guaranteed the quality of goods produced in their workshops and offered to repair or replace any items that didn't meet their standards. This wasn't just good business practice. It was a deliberate attempt to rebuild trust with the outside world. The colony of San Lazzaro near Venice took a different approach, focusing on education and cultural preservation. Residents began collecting and copying manuscripts that were at risk of being lost, creating one of the most comprehensive libraries in northern Italy. They offered their services as scribes and translators to merchants, scholars, and church officials, gradually building a reputation for reliability and expertise that transcended their status as social outcasts. But perhaps the most ambitious project emerged at the Maladrerie de Meaux, east of Paris. In 1302, the residents announced their intention to build a new chapel that would serve not only their own community, but also travellers and pilgrims passing through the region. This was an audacious undertaking for people who possessed neither legal rights nor significant resources. The project was led by Master Guillaume, a former cathedral architect who had been diagnosed with leprosy in the middle of what should have been his most productive years. Guillaume saw the chapel as more than just a building. It was an opportunity to prove that the legally dead could still contribute something beautiful and lasting to the world. Construction began in the spring of 1303 and immediately faced seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The colony had no money for expensive materials, no connections to skilled craftsmen, and no legal authority to undertake such a project. What they did have was determination, creativity, and the kind of collaborative spirit that can only emerge from shared suffering. Guillaume designed a structure that could be built entirely with local materials and volunteer labour. Stone was quarried from abandoned buildings and ruins in the area. Wood was carefully salvaged from trees that had fallen during winter storms. Even the stained glass windows were created, using fragments collected from damaged churches throughout the region. The work progressed slowly, with frequent interruptions as residents fell ill or died. But each setback seemed to strengthen the resolve of those who remained. They developed innovative construction techniques that accommodated the physical limitations imposed by their disease. Pulleys and levers were used extensively to reduce the need for precise manual dexterity. Tasks were broken down into smaller components that could be completed by people with varying abilities. The project attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Healthy craftsmen, initially curious about the unusual construction methods being employed, began offering advice and assistance. Some were motivated by religious conviction, others by professional interest in the innovative techniques being developed. A few seemed genuinely moved by the determination of people who refused to let their circumstances define their limitations. By 1307, the chapel of Saint-Lazare at Meaux was complete. It wasn't grand by the standards of medieval cathedrals, but it was beautiful in its simplicity and profound in its symbolism. The dedication ceremony attracted visitors from across northern France, including several bishops and even a representative of the royal court. More importantly, for the residents of Meaux, the chapel became a source of income and renewed purpose. Pilgrims began making regular stops, drawn by stories of the remarkable community that had built such a beautiful structure, despite overwhelming obstacles. Donations increased dramatically. The colony was able to improve its living conditions, expand its workshops, and even establish a small hospice for newly diagnosed lepers who needed time to adjust to their changed circumstances. The success at Meaux had ripple effects throughout the network of leper colonies that stretched across medieval Europe. Communities that had been struggling for mere survival began to envision larger possibilities. They started collaborative projects, sharing resources and expertise across vast distances. A colony in Germany might send skilled metalworkers to help with construction in Spain, while a community in England might share new medical treatments with colonies in France. This informal network of cooperation among the legally dead created something unprecedented in medieval Europe. A transnational community, united not by nationality, religion, or social class, but by shared experience of exclusion and determination to transcend it. The story of Brother Francis illustrates how this network operated in practice. Francis had been a traveling merchant before his diagnosis, with connections throughout the Mediterranean world. When he arrived at the colony of San Lazzaro near Naples in 1312, he brought with him not just his own skills, but knowledge of dozens of other leper communities he had encountered during his travels. Francis proposed something that seemed impossible: a trade network operated entirely by and for leper colonies. Each community would specialize in producing goods that took advantage of their particular skills and resources, then exchange these products with other colonies to meet their varied needs. The idea faced enormous practical obstacles. Lepers were forbidden from most forms of commerce, restricted in their movements, and viewed with suspicion by the very people they would need as intermediaries. But Francis had spent years learning how to navigate complex trade relationships, and he adapted those skills to his new circumstances. The network began modestly, with just 3 colonies in southern Italy. San Lazzaro specialized in producing high-quality manuscripts and documents. The colony at Brindisi focused on metalwork and tools. A third community near Palermo became known for its textiles and clothing designed specifically for people with physical disabilities. Rather than trying to sell directly to the general public, which would have been nearly impossible, the colonies worked through a carefully selected network of intermediaries. These were typically merchants, monks, or other individuals who had personal connections to leper communities and were willing to vouch for the quality of their products. The system worked because it solved real problems for both buyers and sellers. The colonies could produce goods at lower costs because their labor was essentially free, and they had strong incentives to maintain high quality since their survival depended on customer satisfaction. Buyers benefited from access to specialized products that weren't available elsewhere, often at very competitive prices. Within 5 years, Francis's network had expanded to include more than 20 colonies across Italy, France, and Spain. They were trading everything from illuminated manuscripts to specialized medical devices, From high-quality tools to luxury textiles, some colonies became wealthy enough to expand their facilities, hire additional staff, and even provide financial support to newer or struggling communities. But the most significant impact of this trade network wasn't economic. It was psychological and social. For the first time since their diagnosis, many residents of these colonies began to feel like productive members of society rather than burdens to be endured. Master Pietro, a former goldsmith at San Lazzaro, captured this transformation in a letter to his former apprentice. "I thought my hands would never again create anything of value. The disease has taken much from me, but it has also taught me to see beauty in ways I never imagined. The chalice I am crafting now may be simpler than those I once made for wealthy patrons, but it carries within it something more precious than gold. The knowledge that even we, who are counted among the dead, can still bring light into the world." The psychological impact of productive work extended far beyond individual satisfaction. Colonies that participated in the trade network reported lower rates of suicide, less conflict among residents, and greater willingness to accept new members. The knowledge that their community was contributing something valuable to the world seemed to provide a sense of purpose that mere survival could never offer. This sense of purpose became even more important as medical understanding of leprosy began to evolve during the 14th century. Physicians started to recognize that the disease wasn't always fatal, that some people could live for decades with their symptoms, and that not everyone who showed early signs would develop the full range of disabilities medical advances create associated with advanced cases. These new dilemmas for leper colonies and the people who lived in them. If leprosy wasn't necessarily a death sentence, what did that mean for people who had been declared legally dead? Could someone who had undergone the massive separation ever return to normal society? Were the colonies meant to be temporary refugees or permanent homes? The case of Isabella de Montfort illustrates these complexities perfectly. Isabella was the daughter of a minor noble family in Burgundy, diagnosed with leprosy in 1318 at the age of 19. Her case seemed straightforward at first. She showed the classic early symptoms, underwent the ritual of social death, and was sent to the colony of Sainte-Marie-Madeleine near Dijon. But Isabella's symptoms didn't progress as expected. After 2 years in the colony, her condition had actually improved. The lesions on her skin had faded significantly. Her sensitivity to touch had returned almost to normal. By any reasonable medical standard, she appeared to be recovering from a disease that was supposed to be incurable. Isabella petitioned church authorities for permission to return to her family and reclaim her inheritance. Her case created a legal and theological crisis that reached the highest levels of medieval church hierarchy. Could someone who had been declared dead be declared alive again? What precedent would that set for the thousands of other people living in leper colonies across Europe? The Church's response revealed the deep contradictions at the heart of medieval attitudes toward leprosy and social outcasting. After months of deliberation, Church officials ruled that Isabella's legal death was permanent, regardless of her physical condition. She had been separated from the world through sacred ritual, and that separation could not be undone by mere medical recovery. The ruling devastated Isabella, but it also clarified something important for other colony residents. They were not temporary exiles waiting for a chance to return to their former lives. They were permanent members of a parallel society that existed alongside but separate from the world they had once known. This realization prompted a fundamental shift in how many colonies approached their mission and their future. Rather than simply providing care for the dying, they began to see themselves as builders of alternative communities that could offer meaningful lives to people who had been rejected by mainstream society. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was profound. By the 1320s, colonies across Europe were beginning to reimagine themselves not as warehouses for the condemned, but as laboratories for new ways of living. The colony of Saint-Barthélemy near Toulouse became one of the most ambitious examples of this evolution. When Master Henri arrived at Saint-Barthélemy in 1324, he found a community in the midst of a remarkable experiment. Henri had been a master mason before his diagnosis, responsible for overseeing construction projects throughout southern France. His expertise was immediately recognized by the colony's residents, who had been struggling with a problem that perfectly illustrated their unique position in medieval society. The colony's original buildings were falling apart. Built hastily decades earlier as temporary shelters, they had never been designed to house people for extended periods. Roofs leaked, walls crumbled, and the cold stone floors became unbearable during winter months. But Saint-Barthélemy had accumulated enough resources through their participation in Francis's trade network to contemplate something unprecedented, rebuilding their entire community from the ground up. Henri found himself leading a construction project unlike any he had ever managed. His workforce consisted entirely of people with various physical disabilities, working with limited tools and materials. Traditional construction methods had to be completely reimagined. Heavy stones were moved using elaborate pulley systems operated by people who could no longer grip with their hands. Detailed carving work was performed by residents whose fingers had been damaged, but whose artistic vision remained intact. The most innovative aspect of Henri's design wasn't architectural, but social. Rather than building separate structures for different functions, he created a series of interconnected buildings that formed a complete living environment. Workshops flowed seamlessly into living spaces, which connected directly to common areas for meals and gatherings. The design recognized that residents of Saint-Barthélemy weren't just working together or living together, they were creating something entirely new. A society where the distinction between public and private life had been reimagined. The central courtyard became the heart of this new community. Unlike the cramped utilitarian spaces of earlier leper colonies, Henri designed an area that was both beautiful and functional. Gardens provided food and medicinal herbs, but they also created spaces for contemplation and social interaction. Covered walkways allowed residents to move between buildings, even during harsh weather, while open areas provided venues for the community meetings that had become central to colony governance. But the most revolutionary feature was something that would have been unthinkable in mainstream medieval society. Henri designed living spaces that could accommodate couples and families. The church had always maintained that lepers should live in celibate isolation, focusing entirely on preparation for death and divine judgment. Saint-Barthélemy quietly rejected this doctrine, creating apartments suitable for married couples and even families with children born within the colony. This decision wasn't made lightly or in defiance of religious authority. The residents of Saint-Barthélemy had observed something that church officials refused to acknowledge. People diagnosed with leprosy often lived for decades, and during that time they continued to form deep emotional bonds. Denying these relationships didn't eliminate them, it simply forced them into secrecy and shame. The story of Margot and Jean illustrates how these new living arrangements transformed daily life in the colony. Margot had been a baker's wife in Carcassonne before her diagnosis in 1319. Jean was a former soldier who arrived at Saint-Barthélemy 2 years later. Both had lost spouses to the disease, and both had been told that their capacity for love had died along with their social existence. Their courtship developed slowly over shared work in the colony's expanded bakery. Jean had retained enough dexterity in his hands to help with bread preparation, while Margot's knowledge of recipes and techniques made her invaluable in training other residents. Working side by side, day after day, they discovered that their feelings for each other had nothing to do with their physical condition, and everything to do with shared values, complementary skills, and simple human attraction. When they approached the colony's council about living together as a married couple, they faced opposition from some residents who feared that such arrangements would bring unwanted attention from church authorities. Others worried that romantic relationships would create jealousy and conflict within the community. But Henri, drawing on his experience managing complex construction projects with diverse teams, proposed a solution. Rather than making individual decisions about each relationship, Saint Barthélemy would establish clear guidelines for all residents who wanted to form permanent partnerships. Couples would undergo a waiting period to ensure their commitment was serious. They would contribute additional labor to the community in exchange for private living space. Most importantly, they would accept responsibility for supporting each other through the progression of their disease, removing that burden from the colony's limited resources. Margot and Jean became the first couple to formalize their relationship under these new guidelines. Their simple ceremony in the colony's chapel was attended by the entire community, creating a precedent that would influence dozens of other leper colonies across Europe. Within 5 years, Saint Barthélemy had become known throughout the region as a place where people could build complete lives rather than simply wait to die. The success of these domestic arrangements had unexpected consequences that extended far beyond the colony's walls. Children born to couples within Saint Barthélemy presented legal and social challenges that medieval society had never anticipated. Were these children automatically contaminated by their parents' condition? Could they ever leave the colony and join mainstream society? What rights, if any, did they possess? Little Marie, born to Margot and Jean in 1327, became the focal point for these questions. Marie showed no signs of leprosy, but church law was unclear about whether children of lepers could ever be considered truly clean. Some theologians argued that the spiritual contamination of the parents inevitably passed to their offspring. Others maintained that innocent children shouldn't be punished for their parents' condition. The debate raged for months in ecclesiastical courts across France, but meanwhile, Marie was growing up in Saint Barthélemy as a normal, healthy child. She played with other children in the colony, helped with simple tasks appropriate to her age, and began learning to read from residents who had once been scholars and scribes. Her presence brought joy to a community that had known primarily suffering, but it also raised profound questions about the future. When Marie reached the age of 7, Margot and Jean faced an agonizing decision. They could keep her within the colony, where she would be safe but forever marked as the daughter of lepers, or they could try to place her with relatives outside the walls, giving her a chance at a normal life but losing her forever. The choice was made for them by an unexpected intervention. Brother Augustine, a monk who had been serving as chaplain to Saint Barthélemy, had grown deeply attached to Marie and had watched her development with increasing concern about her future prospects. Without consulting her parents, Augustine petitioned his abbey to accept Marie as a ward of the church. The proposal was controversial but not unprecedented. The church had occasionally taken responsibility for children whose circumstances made normal family life impossible. What made Marie's case unique was that she wasn't an orphan in the traditional sense. Her parents were alive and loving, but their legal status as dead people meant they couldn't provide her with the social acceptance she would need to thrive in the outside world. After months of deliberation, the abbey agreed to accept Marie on the condition that she would have no further contact with her parents or the leper colony. This wasn't just a practical requirement, but a spiritual belief that anyone. The monk's ongoing connection to the world of lepers would contaminate Marie's chances for salvation and social acceptance. The separation was heartbreaking for everyone involved. Marie, at 7 years old, couldn't understand why she was being taken away from the only family and community she had ever known. Margot and Jean understood the reasoning, but struggled with the knowledge that giving their daughter the best chance at life meant sacrificing their own relationship with her. The night before Marie was to leave Saint Barthélemy, the entire community gathered for a farewell ceremony that became one of the most poignant moments in the colony's history. Residents who had lost their own children to death or separation shared stories about Marie's early years. They presented her with small gifts: a wooden doll carved by Jeanne, a simple dress sewn by Margot, a collection of prayers written by various residents who wanted her to remember them. Brother Augustine tried to discourage these emotional displays, worried that they would make Marie's transition more difficult. But Henri, now serving as the colony's unofficial leader, insisted that Marie deserved to understand how much she was loved and how much her presence had meant to the community that had raised her. Marie's departure marked a turning point for Saint-Barthélemy and for the broader network of leper colonies across Europe. The pain of losing her galvanized the community's determination to create better futures for other children who might be born within their walls. They began developing educational programs that would prepare such children for life in the outside world, while also creating opportunities for them to remain connected to their birth families, if they chose. More significantly, Marie's story spread throughout the network of colonies, inspiring similar discussions about family life, child rearing, and the long-term future of these communities. Some colonies chose to discourage romantic relationships entirely, fearing the complications that children would bring. Others, following Saint-Barthélemy's example, began creating more accommodating policies that recognized the full humanity of their residents. The colony of La Trinité near Rouen took perhaps the most radical approach of all. Rather than sending children away when they reached a certain age, La Trinité began preparing them to serve as ambassadors between the world of lepers and mainstream society. These young people, raised within the colonies but not themselves afflicted with the disease, possessed unique insights into both worlds. Young Thomas, born at La Trinité in 1329, became the first of these ambassadors when he reached adulthood in the late 1340s. Unlike Marie, who had been separated from her birth community as a child, Thomas maintained his connections to the colony while also establishing himself as a successful merchant in nearby Rouen. He used his position to advocate for better treatment of lepers, to facilitate trade relationships with the colonies, and to challenge some of the most harmful stereotypes about the disease. Thomas's success inspired other colonies to reconsider their policies toward children and young adults. Rather than viewing them as problems to be solved through separation, they began to see them as potential bridges between their isolated communities and the broader world that had rejected them. This shift in perspective coincided with broader changes in medieval society's understanding of leprosy and social outcasting. The devastating impact of the Black Death in the 1340s had fundamentally altered European attitudes toward disease, death, and social vulnerability. When a plague could kill princes and peasants with equal efficiency, the idea that illness was necessarily a sign of divine disfavor became much harder to maintain. The leper colonies found themselves in the strange position of being better prepared for pandemic conditions than most mainstream communities. Years of dealing with infectious disease, developing systems for caring for the sick, and maintaining social cohesion under extreme stress had given them expertise that was suddenly in high demand. When the plague reached the region around Saint-Barthélemy in 1348, the colony's response was swift and effective. Henri, now in his 60s but still serving as the community's leader, immediately implemented quarantine procedures that were far more sophisticated than anything being attempted in nearby towns. Residents who showed symptoms were isolated but continued to receive care. Food distribution was reorganized to minimize contact between healthy and sick individuals. Most importantly, the colony maintained the community meetings and decision-making processes that had become central to their governance. The contrast with conditions in the surrounding region was stark. Towns and villages were descending into chaos as traditional authorities collapsed under the pressure of mass death. But Saint-Barthélemy continued to function as an organized community, caring for its sick, maintaining essential services, and even providing assistance to healthy refugees who sought shelter within their walls. This reversal of roles, where lepers were caring for healthy people rather than simply receiving charity, challenged fundamental assumptions about the social order. When Brother Augustine returned to Saint-Barthélemy in 1349, fleeing the collapse of his own abbey, He found a community that bore little resemblance to the collection of dying outcasts he had left behind. The colony had not only survived the plague, but had emerged stronger and more confident. They had successfully treated dozens of plague victims using medical techniques developed through years of caring for leprosy patients. They had maintained social order through democratic governance when traditional hierarchies were crumbling everywhere else. Most remarkably, they had demonstrated that people who had been declared dead to the world could still contribute meaningfully to the survival of the living. Augustine's return forced him to confront the contradictions in his own attitudes toward the colony and its residents. He had always viewed his service there as a form of charitable duty, ministering to people who were essentially waiting to die. But the community he found in 1349 was vibrant, productive, and in many ways more successful than the mainstream society he had fled. The experience prompted Augustine to begin writing what would become one of the most important contemporary accounts of life in a medieval leper colony. His chronicles provide detailed descriptions not just of daily routines and physical conditions, but of the complex social and emotional dynamics that had developed within St. Bartholomew's walls. Augustine wrote about the colony's governance system, where former serfs and former nobles worked together to make decisions that affected everyone's welfare. He described the workshops where residents with varying physical abilities collaborated to produce goods that were prized throughout the region. He documented the educational programs that had emerged organically as learned residents shared their knowledge with others. But perhaps most importantly, Augustine captured the psychological transformation that occurred when people who had been stripped of all social identity began to create new identities for themselves. He wrote about residents who had discovered artistic talents they never knew they possessed, about former enemies who had become close friends through shared hardship, about people who had found spiritual peace not despite their condition, but because of it. These chronicles began circulating among monasteries and church authorities across France, challenging prevailing assumptions about leprosy and social outcasting. Augustine's detailed accounts made it impossible to dismiss leper colonies as simple repositories for the dying. They were revealed instead as complex communities where people had created meaningful lives under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The impact of Augustine's writings extended far beyond academic or theological circles. Copies of his chronicles reached noble courts, merchant guilds, and university libraries, sparking debates about social policy, medical understanding, and Christian charity that would continue for decades. One of the most significant responses came from Queen Blanche of Navarre, who ruled as regent for her young son during the 1350s. Blanche had read Augustine's chronicles and was deeply moved by his descriptions of the democratic governance systems that had emerged in several leper colonies. She commissioned a formal study of these communities, seeking to understand whether their innovations might be applicable to broader questions of social organization. The royal investigation, conducted over 2 years by a team of scholars, clergy, and administrators, produced findings that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. The leper colonies weren't just surviving, they were in many cases thriving. Their residents lived longer, reported higher levels of satisfaction, and demonstrated greater social cohesion than comparable populations in mainstream society. More surprisingly, the colonies had developed solutions to problems that plagued medieval society as a whole. Their systems for distributing resources ensured that everyone received adequate food and shelter even during times of scarcity. Their approaches to conflict resolution prevented the kinds of violent disputes that regularly disrupted village life. Their methods for caring for the sick and disabled were more effective and humane than anything available in most towns and cities. Queen Blanche's investigators also documented something that challenged one of the fundamental assumptions underlying the entire system of social outcasting. Many residents of leper colonies were not actually suffering from Hansen's disease. Medieval diagnostic methods were crude and often mistaken. People with other skin conditions, mental illnesses, or simply visible disabilities, had been swept up in the system and declared legally dead, despite having conditions that posed no threat to public health. This revelation should have prompted a wholesale re-evaluation of the entire system of leper colonies and social outcasting. Instead, it created a bureaucratic dilemma that medieval authorities seemed unable to resolve. How could they acknowledge that many people had been wrongly exiled without undermining the entire legal and religious framework that justified the system? The response was characteristically medieval in its complexity and contradiction. Rather than admitting systematic errors, authorities began developing more elaborate criteria for determining who belonged in leper colonies and who didn't. This had the perverse effect of making the diagnostic process even more arbitrary, while simultaneously creating new categories of social outcasts. People who were determined to have been misdiagnosed with leprosy found themselves in an impossible situation. They couldn't return to their former lives because they had been legally declared dead, but they also couldn't remain in leper colonies because they didn't actually have the disease that justified their presence there. A new class of social limbo was created for people who were neither fully alive nor properly dead according to medieval legal categories. The story of Master Bernard illustrates the human cost of these bureaucratic contradictions. Bernard had been a successful goldsmith in Paris before being diagnosed with leprosy in 1342. He spent 7 years at the colony of Saint-Lazare, adapting to his new circumstances and eventually becoming one of the community's most skilled craftsmen and respected leaders. When royal investigators examined Bernard in 1351, they determined that he had never actually suffered from Hansen's disease. His skin condition, while unsightly, was not contagious and would not progress in the ways characteristic of true leprosy. According to the new diagnostic criteria, Bernard should never have been sent to a leper colony in the first place. But Bernard's case presented officials with an uncomfortable question. If he had been wrongly exiled, what compensation did he deserve? His workshop in Paris had been sold, his property distributed to his heirs, and his wife had remarried after his legal death. Even if authorities acknowledged their error, there was no practical way to restore Bernard's former life. More troubling from an administrative perspective, Bernard himself wasn't sure he wanted his former life restored. 7 years in Saint-Lazare had transformed him in ways that went far beyond his physical condition. He had found purpose in his work as a teacher and craftsman within the colony. He had formed deep friendships with other residents. He had discovered aspects of his own character that he never would have encountered in his previous comfortable existence. When offered the opportunity to leave Saint-Lazare and attempt to rebuild his life in mainstream society, Bernard chose to remain in the colony. His decision puzzled officials, who couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily continue living as one of the legally dead. But for Bernard, the choice was simple. The colony had become his home, and its residents had become his family. The prospect of returning to a world that had so easily discarded him held little appeal compared to the community he had helped build within the colony's walls. Bernard's choice was not unique. Across Europe, people who were offered opportunities to leave leper colonies often chose to remain. Some were motivated by practical considerations, others by emotional attachments, but many simply recognized that they had found something within these communities that was rare in medieval society, a place where their worth was measured by their contributions rather than their social status or physical condition. This phenomenon forced medieval authorities to confront an uncomfortable truth about their own society. The people they had cast out as worthless were creating communities that were in many ways more successful, more innovative, and more humane than the mainstream society that had rejected them. The leper colonies weren't just places where outcasts went to die. They were laboratories where new forms of social organization were being developed by people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from experimentation. The recognition of this reality would eventually lead to fundamental changes in how European society approached questions of disease, disability, and social inclusion. But those changes would unfold over centuries, and in the meantime, the residents of leper colonies continued their remarkable experiment in creating meaningful lives on the margins of medieval civilization. As the 14th century progressed, the network of colonies that had grown up across Europe began to function almost as a separate nation, with its own economy, culture, and systems of governance. They had started as repositories for societies unwanted, but they had evolved into something unprecedented, a civilization within a civilization, built by people who refused to accept that legal death meant the end of meaningful life. The transformation of these colonies from places of exile to centers of innovation didn't happen overnight. And it certainly didn't happen without resistance from the very authorities who had created the system in the first place. By the 1360s, church officials were growing increasingly uncomfortable with reports of leper colonies that seemed to be functioning better than many conventional communities. Cardinal Philippe de Mézières, one of the most influential church leaders of his time, visited several colonies in northern France during the winter of 1363. What he found disturbed him profoundly, though perhaps not for the reasons you might expect. The cardinal wasn't troubled by suffering or neglect. Instead, he was alarmed by what he saw as dangerous independence and unauthorized theological innovation. At the colony of Saint-Antoine near Compiègne, Cardinal Philippe witnessed something that challenged everything he believed about divine punishment and spiritual hierarchy. The residents had developed their own interpretation of Christian doctrine that emphasized God's mercy over divine wrath, forgiveness over condemnation, and community responsibility over individual salvation. This wasn't simply a matter of different emphasis in familiar teachings. The residents of Saint-Antoine had essentially created their own theology, one that made sense of their unique circumstances in ways that official church doctrine could not. They argued that their suffering had already purified them of sin, making them closer to God than many people who lived in comfort and ease. They practiced forms of worship that emphasized equality and mutual support, rather than hierarchical authority. Most troubling to Cardinal Philippe was the colony's approach to confession and absolution. Rather than relying solely on ordained priests, residents had developed a system of mutual confession where they sought forgiveness from each other for wrongs committed within the community. They argued that people who had been declared dead to the world had also been freed from many of the social structures that normally governed religious practice. The cardinal's response was swift and harsh. He issued an edict requiring all leper colonies in his jurisdiction to submit to regular inspections by church officials, to limit their religious practices to approved rituals, and to accept appointed chaplains who would ensure orthodox theological instruction. Any colony that refused to comply would lose church support and legal protection. The edict created a crisis that rippled through the network of colonies across Europe. Some communities, particularly those that depended heavily on church funding, reluctantly accepted the new restrictions. Others, especially colonies that had achieved economic independence through their trade networks, chose defiance over submission. The colony of Notre-Dame du Refuge near Lyon became the focal point of this resistance. Led by Sister Catherine, a former abbess who had been diagnosed with leprosy in 1359, the community declared its intention to maintain its autonomous religious practices regardless of official disapproval. Catherine's background made her uniquely qualified to challenge church authority on theological grounds. Before her diagnosis, she had been one of the most respected religious scholars in France, known for her deep knowledge of scripture and church law. Her exile to a leper colony hadn't diminished her intellectual abilities, and she used her expertise to craft sophisticated arguments defending the community's religious innovations. In a series of letters to church authorities, Catherine argued that the unique circumstances of leper colonies required unique approaches to spiritual care. People who had been declared legally dead, she contended, existed in a liminal state that traditional religious categories couldn't adequately address. They needed new forms of worship that acknowledged their special relationship with suffering, death, and divine mercy. More provocatively, Catherine suggested that the residents of leper colonies might actually be closer to understanding God's will than many ordained clergy. Their daily experience of pain, isolation, and dependence on divine grace, she argued, provided insights into Christian truth that could only be gained through profound suffering. These arguments weren't merely academic exercises. Catherine was articulating a theological framework that gave meaning and dignity to experiences that official church doctrine could only explain as divine punishment. Her letters began circulating among other colonies, inspiring similar declarations of religious independence. The church's response escalated quickly from bureaucratic pressure to direct intervention. In the spring of 1365, Cardinal Philippe personally led a delegation to Notre-Dame du Refuge, intending to force the community into compliance with his earlier edict. What he found there challenged his expectations even more dramatically than his previous visits to other colonies. Notre-Dame du Refuge had grown into something that resembled a small city, more than a simple refuge for the dying. The original buildings had been expanded and improved using architectural techniques that Catherine and other residents had developed specifically for people with various physical disabilities. The workshops produced goods that were sought after throughout the region. Most remarkably, the community had established what was essentially the first hospital in medieval Europe, designed specifically to serve people with chronic illnesses and disabilities. This hospital wasn't just treating leprosy patients. Word had spread about the colony's innovative approaches to medical care, and people with other conditions that mainstream physicians couldn't treat were seeking admission. The community had developed surgical techniques for removing damaged tissue, created prosthetic devices for people who had lost limbs, and even established protocols for managing pain that wouldn't be matched by conventional medicine for centuries. Cardinal Philippe found himself in the awkward position of condemning a community that was clearly providing valuable services to people who had nowhere else to turn. His theological objections to their religious practices seemed petty compared to their practical achievements in caring for the sick and disabled. The confrontation between Catherine and Cardinal Philippe became one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of medieval leper colonies. Catherine, now in her 50s and showing visible signs of her disease's progression, met the cardinal's delegation at the colony's gates, wearing simple robes but carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had found peace with her circumstances. The cardinal began by reading the formal charges against the community. Unauthorized religious practices, failure to submit to church authority, and dangerous theological innovations that threatened the spiritual welfare of their residents. Catherine's response was measured but firm. She acknowledged the Church's authority in matters of doctrine, but argued that the unique circumstances of leper colonies required special consideration. The debate that followed lasted 3 days and attracted observers from across northern France. Catherine demonstrated her deep knowledge of scripture and church law, citing precedents for communities that had been granted special privileges due to extraordinary circumstances. She argued that people who had been separated from the world through sacred ritual existed in a different relationship to conventional religious authority. More compellingly, Catherine invited the cardinal to observe the daily life of the community. She showed him residents who were engaged in meaningful work, caring for each other through the progression of their illness, and finding spiritual fulfillment in ways that conventional religious practice had never provided them. She introduced him to people who had arrived at the colony in despair and had discovered purpose, community, and even joy within its walls. The cardinal's visit concluded without a clear resolution, but it marked a turning point in the relationship between church authorities and leper colonies. Rather than forcing immediate compliance with his edict, Cardinal Philippe agreed to establish a commission that would study the theological and practical questions raised by Catherine's community. This commission, which included some of the most distinguished theologians and canon lawyers in Europe, spent 2 years examining the religious practices of various leper colonies. Their final report, issued in 1367, represented a remarkable compromise between church authority and colonial autonomy. The commission acknowledged that leper colonies existed in circumstances that weren't adequately addressed by conventional church doctrine. They recommended that such communities be granted limited autonomy in their religious practices, provided they maintained basic Christian orthodoxy and submitted to periodic inspection by church authorities. More significantly, the report recognized that residents of leper colonies had developed insights into Christian spirituality that could benefit the broader church. The Commission recommended that selected colonies be designated as centers for theological study and spiritual innovation, where new approaches to caring for the sick and suffering could be developed and tested. Catherine's victory wasn't complete, but it established important precedents that would influence the development of leper colonies for centuries to come. Communities that could demonstrate both theological soundness and practical effectiveness would be granted considerable autonomy in determining their own religious and social practices. This new relationship between church and colonies enabled even more ambitious experiments in community organization. The colony of Sainte Marguerite near Toulouse used its newfound freedom to establish what was essentially the first democratic religious community in medieval Europe. Residents elected their own spiritual leaders, made collective decisions about worship practices, and developed systems of mutual accountability that emphasized personal responsibility rather than hierarchical authority. Brother Michel, a former Benedictine monk who arrived at Sainte Marguerite in 1368, initially struggled with the community's unconventional approaches to religious life. In his former monastery, every aspect of daily routine had been determined by ancient rules and supervised by appointed authorities. The idea that ordinary people, especially people marked by disease, could make their own spiritual decisions seemed dangerous and presumptuous. But Michel's resistance gradually gave way to appreciation as he observed how the community's democratic practices actually strengthened rather than weakened their religious commitment. Residents who had chosen their own spiritual disciplines were more likely to maintain them consistently. People who had participated in developing worship practices felt more connected to their spiritual meaning. Most importantly, the community's emphasis on mutual support created bonds of Christian love that Michel had rarely experienced in conventional religious settings. Michael's transformation from skeptic to advocate illustrates how the innovations developed in leper colonies were beginning to influence broader religious thought. His letters to former colleagues in other monasteries described spiritual practices that challenged conventional assumptions about authority, hierarchy, and religious discipline. These letters contributed to growing interest among mainstream religious communities in the experiments being conducted in leper colonies. By the 1370s, delegations of healthy nuns and clergy monks were making regular visits to colonies that had been granted autonomy, seeking to learn from their innovations in community organization and spiritual practice. The irony wasn't lost on residents of these colonies that people who had been declared spiritually contaminated were now being consulted as experts on Christian living. But most welcomed these visitors, seeing them as opportunities to share insights that had been hard-won through years of suffering and adaptation. Sister Marie-Claire of the Paul colony of Saint-Nair-Avignon became one of the most sought-after spiritual advisors of her time. Before her diagnosis in 1361, she had been a relatively obscure nun in a small convent. Her exile to a leper colony had forced her to develop new approaches to prayer, meditation, and community life that proved remarkably effective in helping people find meaning in the midst of suffering. Marie-Claire's innovation was deceptively simple but profoundly revolutionary. Rather than viewing suffering as something to be endured passively while waiting for divine relief, she taught residents to engage actively with their pain as a form of spiritual discipline. She developed meditation practices that helped people find peace even in the midst of physical discomfort, and she created rituals that transformed daily struggles into opportunities for spiritual growth. Her methods attracted attention far beyond the leper colony. Healthy people dealing with grief, illness, or other forms of suffering began seeking her guidance. Even church officials, who had initially been suspicious of theological innovations in leper colonies, began consulting Marie Claire about pastoral care for people facing extreme hardships. Marie Claire's influence extended through a network of correspondence that reached across Europe and even into the Islamic world. Her letters, written in elegant Latin despite the physical difficulties imposed by her advancing disease, provided practical advice for people struggling with various forms of adversity. More importantly, they articulated a theology of suffering that gave dignity and purpose to experiences that conventional religious thought could only explain as punishment or trial. The success of spiritual innovators like Marie Claire helped establish leper colonies as centers of religious creativity rather than simply repositories for the condemned. By the 1380s, several colonies had become pilgrimage destinations, where healthy people came seeking spiritual guidance from residents who had found meaning in the midst of extreme adversity. This reversal of spiritual authority created new challenges for both the colonies and the church hierarchy. Communities that had been established to isolate dangerous outcasts were now attracting visitors who wanted to learn from their spiritual insights. The careful barriers that had been constructed to separate the legally dead from the living were becoming increasingly porous. The colony of Saint-Roch, near Montpellier, faced this challenge most directly when they were approached by a group of wealthy merchants who wanted to establish a retreat center adjacent to the colony. These merchants had heard about the community's innovations in spiritual practice and wanted to create a place where healthy people could come for extended periods of prayer and meditation under the guidance of colony residents. The proposal was unprecedented and controversial. Church authorities worried about the implications of healthy people voluntarily associating with lepers. Colony residents were divided about whether they wanted their community to become a destination for spiritual tourism. Some saw it as an opportunity to share their hard-won insights with a broader audience, while others feared that an influx of visitors would fundamentally change the character of their community. After months of debate, the residents of Saint-Roch voted to accept the proposal on their own terms. They would welcome visitors who came seeking genuine spiritual growth, but these guests would have to live according to the community's rules and participate fully in colony life. There would be no special accommodations for wealth or social status, and visitors would be expected to contribute their labor to the community's survival. The retreat center opened in 1384 and immediately attracted attention throughout southern France. Unlike conventional monasteries or pilgrimage sites, Saint-Roch offered visitors the opportunity to experience community life with people who had been forced to confront mortality, suffering, and social rejection in ways that most people never would. The first group of retreatants included merchants, nobles, clergy, and even a few university scholars who were curious about the theological innovations they had heard described. All were required to participate in the daily routines of colony life, caring for residents who were seriously ill, working in the workshops and gardens, and participating in the community meetings where collective decisions were made. Most visitors arrived expecting to offer charity to unfortunate outcasts, and instead found themselves receiving insights about life, death, and spiritual meaning that they had never encountered elsewhere. The experience was transformative for many, and word spread quickly about the unique opportunities available at Saint-Roch. Master Guillaume, a wealthy cloth merchant from Marseille, arrived at Saint-Roch in 1385, expecting to spend a few weeks in prayer and contemplation before returning to his business activities. Instead, he found himself drawn into a community that challenged everything he thought he knew about success, purpose, and spiritual fulfillment. Guillaume had built his fortune through shrewd trading and careful attention to market opportunities, but he had begun to feel increasingly empty despite his material success. His visit to Saint-Roch was intended as a brief spiritual retreat, a way to ease his conscience about his wealth while maintaining his comfortable lifestyle. Working alongside colony residents in their workshops, Guillaume encountered people who had lost everything material but had discovered forms of satisfaction that his wealth had never provided. He met former nobles who had found greater purpose in caring for sick neighbours than they had ever experienced in managing vast estates. He observed craftsmen who took more pride in creating tools adapted for disabled users than they had ever felt in producing luxury goods for wealthy customers. Most profoundly, Guillaume witnessed daily examples of courage, generosity, and spiritual depth from people who had every reason to be bitter and despairing. Residents who were losing their sight taught others to navigate by touch. People whose hands had been damaged by disease developed new techniques that others could use. Individuals who were facing their own mortality spent their remaining energy creating beauty and meaning for their community. Guillaume's planned 2-week retreat extended to 2 months, then to 6 months, and finally to a permanent change in his life direction. He liquidated his business, donated most of his wealth to support various leper colonies, and established himself as a permanent resident of Saint-Roch. His transformation wasn't unique. The retreat centre attracted a steady stream of visitors who arrived as tourists, but remained as converts to a radically different way of understanding life's priorities. Some, like Guillaume, made permanent commitments to colony life. Others returned to their previous occupations, but carried with them new perspectives on wealth, success, and human relationships. The influence of these converted visitors extended far beyond the colonies themselves. Guillaume used his business connections to establish trade networks that provided steady income for dozens of leper communities. Other former retreatants became advocates for better treatment of outcasts, founded charitable organizations, or simply approached their daily lives with greater compassion and humility. By the 1390s, the retreat center model developed at Saint-Roch had been adopted by more than a dozen leper colonies across Europe. These communities found themselves in the paradoxical position of being simultaneously places of exile and destinations for people seeking spiritual enlightenment. This transformation had profound implications for how medieval society understood the relationship between suffering and wisdom, between social outcasting and spiritual insight. The people who had been declared legally dead were proving to be very much alive in ways that mattered most for human flourishing. But perhaps most remarkably, they were demonstrating that meaningful community could be built even under the most challenging circumstances. That dignity could be maintained even in the face of systematic dehumanization, and that hope could flourish even in places designed for despair. The story of medieval leper colonies was far from over, but by the end of the 14th century, they had already proven something remarkable about human resilience and creativity. Communities that had been established as warehouses for societies unwanted had evolved into laboratories for new forms of social organization, spiritual practice, and human relationship. These achievements hadn't eliminated the suffering that brought people to leper colonies in the first place, but they had demonstrated that suffering itself didn't have to be the end of the story. In the hands of people who refused to accept that legal death meant the end of meaningful life, even exile could become an opportunity for transformation. The residents of these colonies had created something unprecedented in medieval Europe. Communities where worth was measured by contribution rather than status, where governance was based on consensus rather than hierarchy, and where spiritual authority came from wisdom gained through suffering rather than appointment by institutional power. Their innovations would influence European thought and practice in ways that extended far beyond questions of medical care or social policy. They had proven that alternative forms of community organization were not only possible, but could be more successful than conventional approaches in addressing fundamental human needs for meaning, purpose, and connection. As the medieval period drew toward its close, the leper colonies stood as monuments to human creativity under constraint, testaments to the possibility of finding hope in hopeless circumstances, and challenges to anyone who would dismiss people as worthless based on their physical condition or social status. The legally dead had not only survived, but had created forms of life that put the living to shame. Their story was a reminder that human dignity doesn't depend on social recognition, that meaningful community doesn't require official approval, and that the most profound innovations often emerge from the margins of society rather than its centers of power. The innovations pioneered in medieval leper colonies would face their greatest test as the 15th century dawned, bringing with it changes that would challenge everything these communities had built. The rise of centralized monarchies, shifts in medical understanding, and the growing power of secular authorities created new pressures that would force these remarkable societies to adapt once again or face extinction. King Charles VII of France, fresh from his victories over the English and his coronation at Reims in 1429, turned his attention to what he saw as irregularities in the administration of his realm. Among his concerns were reports of leper colonies that seemed to operate with suspicious independence from royal authority. These communities controlled significant resources, maintained their own systems of governance, and in some cases had accumulated enough wealth to rival minor noble estates. The king's investigation began with the colony of Sainte-Foy near Orléans, which had grown prosperous through its participation in the trade networks established decades earlier. When royal commissioners arrived in the spring of 1431, they found a community that bore little resemblance to the simple refuge for the dying that official records described. Sainte-Foy housed nearly 200 residents in well-constructed buildings that included workshops, libraries, and even a small infirmary that served people from surrounding villages. The community owned extensive farmland, operated several profitable businesses, and maintained diplomatic relationships with colonies across Europe. Most troubling to royal officials, the residents had developed their own legal system for resolving disputes and made collective decisions about resource allocation without consulting any external authority. Master Robert, who had served as the colony's elected leader for over a decade, found himself in the impossible position of explaining to royal commissioners how a community of legally dead people had managed to accumulate so much worldly success. Robert had been a minor court official before his diagnosis in 1418, and he understood the bureaucratic mindset that viewed any unauthorized accumulation of power as a potential threat to royal authority. The commissioner's questions revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the entire system. If lepers were truly dead to the world, how could they own property, conduct business, or exercise political authority? If they were capable of such sophisticated social organization, why did they need to remain isolated from mainstream society? Most dangerously, if these communities could function successfully without royal oversight, what did that suggest about the necessity of royal authority elsewhere? Robert's responses were carefully calibrated to acknowledge royal supremacy while defending his community's achievements. He emphasized that everything Sainte-Foy had accomplished was directed toward caring for society's most vulnerable members. Their wealth existed not for personal enrichment, but to ensure that people who had lost everything could live with dignity. Their governance systems existed not to challenge royal authority, but to manage the complex logistics of caring for 200 people with varying needs and abilities. But the commissioners were less interested in Robert's explanations than in the precedent his community represented. Word of Sainte-Foy's success had spread throughout France, inspiring other marginalized groups to question why they couldn't organize similar autonomous communities. Peasants facing economic hardship wondered why they couldn't form cooperative settlements like the leper colonies. Artisans struggling under guild restrictions looked enviously at the workshops where residents freely shared knowledge and techniques. The royal response was swift and comprehensive. New regulations required all leper colonies to accept appointed overseers who would monitor their activities and ensure compliance with royal law. Communities that had accumulated significant wealth were required to surrender a portion of their assets to the royal treasury. Most significantly, the informal networks that had allowed colonies to coordinate activities across vast distances were declared illegal associations that threatened royal authority. The implementation of these new regulations created a crisis that rippled through the network of colonies across Europe. Communities that had spent decades building autonomous institutions suddenly found themselves subject to the whims of appointed officials who often knew nothing about the unique challenges of caring for people with chronic illnesses and disabilities. At the colony of Saint-Pierre near Bordeaux, the newly appointed royal overseer was a young nobleman named Henri de Montclair, who viewed his assignment as punishment for some unspecified court indiscretion. Henri arrived expecting to find a simple collection of dying beggars who could be managed with minimal effort. Instead, he encountered a complex organization that operated multiple businesses, maintained diplomatic relations with similar communities across Europe, and had developed innovative solutions to problems he had never imagined. Henri's first official act was to demand a complete accounting of the colony's finances, a task that revealed the sophisticated economic systems residents had developed over decades of detailed records of production costs, autonomous operation. They maintain profit margins and resource allocation that would have impressed any royal accountant. They had established credit relationships with merchants across southern France and maintained reserve funds for emergencies that demonstrated remarkable fiscal responsibility. More troubling to Henri was the discovery that many residents possessed skills and knowledge that far exceeded his own. Former scholars continued their intellectual work within the colony, producing manuscripts and conducting research that was sought after by universities across Europe. Former craftsmen had developed techniques and tools that were revolutionizing their trades. Former administrators had created management systems that were more efficient than anything Henri had encountered in royal bureaucracy. The young nobleman found himself in the humbling position of trying to supervise people who were clearly more competent than he was at almost every aspect of community management. His attempts to impose external authority were met not with rebellion, but with patient explanations of why existing systems worked better than the alternatives he proposed. Sister Anne, a former abbess who had become one of Saint-Pierre's most respected leaders, took it upon herself to educate Henri about the realities of colony life. She began by showing him the community's medical facilities, where residents had developed treatments for various conditions that mainstream physicians couldn't address. They had created surgical instruments designed specifically for people with limited dexterity, developed pain management techniques that relied on community support rather than expensive medicines, and established protocols for caring for people through the final stages of terminal illness. Anne then introduced Henri to the workshops where residents produced goods that were prized throughout the region. She showed him looms adapted for people who had lost fingers, forges designed to accommodate workers with limited mobility, and scriptoriums where partially blind scribes continued to copy manuscripts using ingenious magnification techniques. Every adaptation represented years of experimentation and refinement by people who had been forced to find new ways of accomplishing familiar tasks. Most profoundly, Anne helped Henri understand the psychological and spiritual innovations that had emerged from the community's unique circumstances. She introduced him to residents who had discovered artistic talents they never knew they possessed, to former enemies who had become close friends through shared hardship, to people who had found meaning and purpose in lives that society had declared worthless. Henri's education in the realities of colony life gradually transformed his understanding of his role and responsibilities. Rather than imposing external authority on a chaotic situation, he found himself trying to preserve and protect innovations that clearly benefited not just colony residents, but society as a whole. His reports to royal authorities began emphasizing the community's contributions rather than their irregularities. But Henri's conversion to advocacy for the colonies came too late to prevent the broader crackdown that was already underway. Across France, royal commissioners were dismantling the networks and institutions that colonies had spent decades building. Communities that had achieved economic independence found themselves forced to surrender their assets. Democratic governance systems were replaced with appointed hierarchies that often had little understanding of residents' actual needs. The human cost of these changes was immediate and devastating. At the colony of Notre-Dame-de-Pitié near Lyon, the royal overseer decided that the community's workshops were too profitable and might attract unwanted attention from tax collectors. He ordered the closure of the metalworking shop that had provided income for over 50 residents and had been renowned throughout the region for the quality of its products. Master François, who had spent 15 years developing the specialized techniques that made the workshop profitable, watched helplessly as tools and equipment he had designed were sold to pay for the overseer's administrative expenses. The closure didn't just eliminate income for the community, it destroyed knowledge and skills that had taken years to develop and couldn't easily be recreated elsewhere. François' response illustrates the quiet desperation that gripped many colony residents as their carefully constructed worlds were systematically dismantled. Rather than accepting the destruction of his life's work, he began secretly teaching his techniques to residents of other colonies, hoping to preserve knowledge that official policy seemed determined to eliminate. Working under cover of darkness and using coded messages to avoid detection by royal overseers, François established an underground network of craftsmen who continued sharing techniques and innovations despite official prohibitions. They developed new ways of communicating across distances, created hidden workshops that could be quickly dismantled if discovered, and established protocols for protecting the most vulnerable members of their communities from bureaucratic interference. This resistance network reveals something important about the residents of leper colonies that official policies consistently underestimated. These weren't passive victims waiting for charity or authority figures to solve their problems. They were creative, resourceful people who had already proven their ability to build meaningful communities under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The underground networks that emerged in response to royal crackdowns demonstrated organizational skills and strategic thinking that would have impressed any military commander or political leader. Communities coordinated their activities across hundreds of miles, maintained security protocols that protected their most vulnerable members, and adapted quickly to changing circumstances without losing sight of their fundamental goals. Brother Philippe, a former military engineer who had arrived at the colony of Saint-Julien near Toulouse in 1428, became one of the most effective organizers of resistance activities. Philippe had spent years designing fortifications and siege engines before his diagnosis forced him into exile, and he applied those same analytical skills to the problem of protecting colony innovations from official interference. Philippe's approach was characteristically systematic. He began by mapping the network of colonies across southern France, identifying which communities possessed which specialized knowledge and skills. He then established secure communication channels that allowed communities to share information without detection by royal overseers. Most importantly, he developed contingency plans for preserving essential knowledge and resources if specific colonies were forced to close. The network Philippe created operated on principles that would have seemed familiar to any underground resistance movement. Information was compartmentalized so that the capture of one cell couldn't compromise the entire operation. Multiple backup systems ensured that critical knowledge wouldn't be lost if key individuals were removed or died. Most importantly, the network maintained its focus on helping the most vulnerable members of colony communities, rather than pursuing abstract political goals. One of Philippe's most successful innovations was the establishment of hidden schools, where colony residents could continue learning and teaching despite official restrictions on their activities. These schools operated in abandoned buildings, forest clearings, and even caves, moving frequently to avoid detection. They preserved not just practical knowledge about crafts and medicine, but also intellectual traditions that official policy seemed determined to eliminate. Master Isabelle, a former university lecturer who had been exiled to Saint-Julien in 1433, became one of the most sought-after teachers in Philippe's underground education network. Before her diagnosis, Isabelle had been one of the few women permitted to teach at the University of Paris. specializing in natural philosophy and mathematics. Her exile had ended her official academic career, but it hadn't diminished her intellectual abilities or her commitment to education. Isabel's hidden classes attracted students from across the region, including some healthy individuals who were willing to risk official disapproval to access knowledge that wasn't available elsewhere. She taught advanced mathematics to former merchants who wanted to improve their business skills, natural philosophy to craftsmen who were developing new techniques, and logic to community leaders who needed to make complex decisions about resource allocation. But Isabel's most important contribution was her work with young people who had been born in leper colonies or had arrived there as children. Official policy provided no education for these individuals, assuming they would die young and had no need for intellectual development. Isabel proved that assumption wrong by demonstrating that these students were just as capable of learning as their counterparts in mainstream society. Her star pupil was a young man named Thomas, who had been born at Saint-Julien in 1420 to parents who had both been diagnosed with leprosy. Thomas showed no signs of the disease himself, but his birth within a leper colony meant he was considered contaminated and could never leave to join mainstream society. Official policy assumed he would live out his days as a simple laborer, contributing basic work to the community's survival, but never developing his intellectual potential. Under Isabel's guidance, Thomas mastered Latin, Greek, mathematics, and natural philosophy to a level that would have qualified him for university study if his circumstances had been different. More importantly, he developed a deep understanding of the social and political forces that shaped life in leper colonies, making him uniquely qualified to advocate for their interests. Thomas's education represented something revolutionary in medieval European society: the development of intellectual leadership from within marginalized communities rather than imposed from outside. He understood the daily realities of colony life in ways that no appointed overseer ever could. But he also possessed the analytical skills needed to articulate complex arguments about social policy and human rights. When Thomas reached adulthood in the early 1440s, he began writing letters to church and royal authorities, arguing for reforms in how leper colonies were administered. His arguments were sophisticated and carefully reasoned, drawing on legal precedent, theological doctrine, and practical experience to make the case that current policies were both ineffective and unjust. Thomas's letters reveal the emergence of something unprecedented in medieval Europe: articulate advocacy for the rights of people who had been systematically excluded from political participation. His arguments went beyond simple pleas for better treatment to fundamental questions about human dignity, social responsibility, and the relationship between individual worth and social utility. One of Thomas's most powerful letters, addressed to the Duke of Aquitaine in 1444, challenged the basic assumptions underlying the entire system of social outcasting. He argued that the legal fiction of declaring people dead while they continued to live created contradictions that undermined the rule of law itself. How could dead people own property, enter contracts, or be held responsible for their actions? If they were truly dead, why did they need to be governed at all? More provocatively, Thomas suggested that the innovations developed in leper colonies demonstrated the failure of mainstream society to address fundamental human needs. Communities of legally dead people had created more effective systems of healthcare, education, and social support than existed in most towns and cities. They had developed more democratic forms of governance and more equitable methods of resource distribution. If outcasts could achieve such success, what did that say about the competence of the authorities who had cast them out? Thomas's letters began circulating among noble courts, church hierarchies, and university communities, sparking debates about social policy that hadn't occurred since the establishment of the leper colony system centuries earlier. Some authorities dismissed his arguments as the ravings of a contaminated mind, but others began to question whether current policies actually served their intended purposes. The Duke of Aquitaine himself was sufficiently intrigued by Thomas's arguments to order an investigation of leper colonies in his territory. The resulting report, completed in 1446, confirmed many of Thomas's claims about productive nature of many, the effectiveness of colony innovations, and the counter-official restrictions. But the Duke's investigation also revealed something that Thomas hadn't anticipated: the extent to which leper colonies had become integrated into the broader economy and society, despite official policies designed to maintain their isolation. Colony workshops provided goods and services that were essential to surrounding communities. Colony schools educated children who would otherwise have no access to learning. Colony medical facilities treated conditions that mainstream physicians couldn't address. The investigation found that closing leper colonies or severely restricting their activities would create significant hardships, not just for their residents, but for the broader population that had come to depend on their contributions. The communities that had been established to isolate dangerous outcasts had become so useful that their elimination would cause more problems than their continued existence. This discovery forced authorities to confront an uncomfortable truth about their own policies. The system designed to protect mainstream society from contamination had actually created communities that were more innovative, more productive, and more socially cohesive than many conventional settlements. The people who had been declared worthless had proven their worth in ways that couldn't be ignored. The response to this revelation varied dramatically across different regions and jurisdictions. Some authorities chose to maintain existing restrictions despite their obvious ineffectiveness, preferring familiar policies to the uncertainty of reform. Others began experimenting with more flexible approaches that acknowledged the reality of what leper colonies had become. The Bishop of Toulouse, influenced by reports from the Duke of Aquitaine's investigation, announced a new policy in 1448 that granted limited autonomy to colonies in his jurisdiction that could demonstrate their value to surrounding communities. This policy wasn't a complete reversal of traditional approaches, but it represented official recognition that blanket restrictions on colony activities might not serve anyone's interests. Under this new policy, the colony of Sainte-Marie near Carcassonne was granted permission to establish formal trade relationships with surrounding towns, to operate schools that served children from outside the colony, and to maintain the democratic governance systems they had developed over decades of autonomous operation. In exchange, they accepted regular inspections by church officials and agreed to contribute a portion of their income to support other charitable activities. The arrangement was mutually beneficial in ways that surprised both church authorities and colony residents. The bishop gained access to innovative educational and medical programs that enhanced his reputation for progressive leadership. The colony gained legal protection for activities they had been conducting secretly for years, allowing them to expand their services and improve their facilities. Most importantly, the new arrangement created a model that could be adapted by other jurisdictions facing similar challenges. Rather than viewing leper colonies as problems to be solved through isolation and restriction, authorities could begin seeing them as resources that could contribute to broader social goals. Sister Marguerite, who had served as elected leader of Sainte-Marie for over a decade, understood the significance of this policy shift better than most. In her correspondence with leaders of other colonies, she emphasized that official recognition of their autonomy wasn't just a practical advantage, but a fundamental change in how society viewed people who had been cast out. For the first time since the establishment of the leper colony system, official policy acknowledged that people who had been declared legally dead could still make valuable contributions to the living world. This recognition opened possibilities that had been unthinkable just years earlier. Formal education programs, legitimate business relationships, and even limited political participation. But Marguerite also understood that this recognition came with new responsibilities and dangers. Colonies that accepted official autonomy also accepted official scrutiny. They had to demonstrate their value continuously or risk losing the privileges they had gained. More troubling, Success might attract unwanted attention from authorities who saw profitable enterprises as sources of potential revenue. The tension between opportunity and vulnerability that Marguerite identified would define the next phase of leper colony development. Communities that had spent decades learning to survive in isolation now had to learn how to thrive under official supervision. They needed to maintain the innovations that had made them successful, while adapting to new expectations and restrictions that came with legitimate recognition. The colony of Saint-Étienne near Marseille illustrates both the possibilities and the pitfalls of this transition. Under the leadership of Master Guillaume, the former cloth merchant who had transformed his life during a retreat at Saint-Roch decades earlier, Saint-Étienne had become one of the most prosperous colonies in southern France. Their workshops produced goods that were sought after throughout the Mediterranean world. Their schools attracted students from across the region, and their medical facilities served people who travelled hundreds of miles for treatment. When local authorities offered Saint-Étienne the opportunity to operate under the new autonomous arrangement, Guillaume and the colony's residents faced a difficult decision. Official recognition would allow them to expand their activities and improve their security, but it would also expose them to taxation, regulation, and potential interference that could undermine everything they had built. The debate within Saint-Étienne lasted for months and revealed fundamental disagreements about the colony's future direction. Some residents, led by Guillaume, argued that official recognition was essential for long-term survival. They pointed to other colonies that had been forcibly closed or severely restricted because they operated without legal protection. Official autonomy, even with its limitations, was better than continued vulnerability to arbitrary interference. Others, led by Brother Antoine, the former merchant who had become one of the colony's most successful fundraisers, argued that official recognition would destroy the very qualities that had made their community successful. They had thrived precisely because they operated outside conventional social structures. Accepting official oversight would force them to conform to expectations that might be incompatible with their residents' actual needs. The debate was complicated by practical considerations that went beyond philosophical preferences. Saint-Étienne had accumulated significant wealth through decades of careful management and successful business operations. Official recognition might protect that wealth from arbitrary seizure, but it would also subject them to taxation that could consume much of their resources. They had developed trade relationships that operated in legal grey areas, profitable but potentially vulnerable to official interference. Most importantly, the colony had become home to people whose presence might not be acceptable under official scrutiny. Some residents had never actually suffered from leprosy, but had been misdiagnosed and sent to the colony years or decades earlier. Others had been born within the colony, but showed no signs of disease. Still others were healthy individuals who had chosen to join the community for personal or spiritual reasons. Official recognition would require clear documentation of each resident's status and justification for their presence within the colony. This bureaucratic requirement threatened to expose irregularities that could result in forced separations of families, loss of valuable community members, and potential criminal charges for harbouring people who weren't supposed to be there. Guillaume's response to these concerns illustrates the pragmatic wisdom that had made him successful both as a merchant and as a colony leader. Rather than making a unilateral decision, he proposed that Saint-Étienne negotiate specific terms with local authorities before accepting or rejecting official recognition. They would seek guarantees that existing residents could remain regardless of their technical status, that their governance systems could continue operating with minimal interference, and that taxation would be based on their ability to pay rather than arbitrary assessments. The negotiations that followed were unprecedented in medieval European history. A community of legally dead people was bargaining with official authorities as equals, demanding specific protections and concessions in exchange for accepting legitimate status. The very fact that such negotiations could occur represented a fundamental shift in social relationships that would have been unimaginable when the leper colony system was first established. The final agreement, reached in the spring of 1452, granted Saint-Étienne most of what they had requested, while establishing precedents that would influence similar negotiations across Europe. The colony gained legal protection for their property and activities, formal recognition of their governance systems, and guarantees that existing residents could remain regardless of their medical status. In exchange, they accepted limited taxation, regular inspections, and requirements to document their activities for official review. Most significantly, the agreement established Saint-Étienne as a formal corporation with legal rights and responsibilities similar to those of a town or guild. This corporate status allowed them to enter contracts, own property, and conduct business relationships that had previously existed in legal limbo. For the first time since the establishment of the leper colony system, a community of outcasts had achieved legitimate recognition as a legal entity, with rights that authorities were bound to respect. The success of Saint-Étienne's negotiations encouraged similar efforts by colonies across Europe, but it also revealed the enormous variations in local conditions and official attitudes that made each situation unique. What worked in Marseille might not be acceptable in Paris or London. Authorities who were willing to grant autonomy to prosperous, well-organized communities might refuse to make similar arrangements with colonies that were struggling or controversial. The colony of Sainte-Anne near Rouen discovered these limitations when they attempted to negotiate their own autonomous arrangement in 1453. Unlike Saint-Étienne, Sainte-Anne had never achieved economic prosperity or developed the sophisticated organizational systems that impressed official inspectors. Their residents were primarily elderly people in the final stages of various diseases, supported by charitable donations rather than productive enterprises. When Sainte-Anne petitioned for autonomous status, local authorities questioned what value such a community could provide to justify special treatment. The colony couldn't point to innovative workshops, successful schools, or medical facilities that served broader populations. Their primary contribution was simply providing dignified care for people who had nowhere else to go, a function that authorities didn't consider sufficiently valuable to warrant legal recognition. The rejection of Sainte-Anne's petition highlights one of the most troubling aspects of the new policies toward leper colonies. Official recognition was becoming contingent on demonstrable utility rather than basic human rights. Communities that could prove their economic value might gain autonomy and protection, but those that simply provided care for the most vulnerable members of society remained subject to arbitrary interference or closure. Sister Claire, who had served as Sainte-Anne's leader for over 20 years, understood the implications of this policy shift better than most. In her letters to other colony leaders, she warned that the new emphasis on demonstrable utility threatened to abandon the most fundamental purpose of leper colonies, providing refuge for people who had been rejected by mainstream society. Claire argued that colonies like Sainte-Anne performed an essential social function that couldn't be measured in economic terms. They demonstrated that society retained some commitment to caring for its most vulnerable members, even when those members couldn't contribute to productive activities. They provided models of compassionate care that challenged the purely utilitarian values that were becoming dominant in medieval European society. More practically, Claire pointed out that colonies focused on end-of-life care possessed knowledge and experience that could benefit the broader population. They had developed techniques for managing pain, supporting families through terminal illness, and helping people find meaning and dignity in their final days. This knowledge was just as valuable as the technical innovations developed in colony workshops, even if it couldn't be converted into marketable products. Claire's arguments gained unexpected support from an unlikely source, Master Jean, a royal physician who had been investigating medical practices in various leper colonies as part of the broader official review of these communities. Jean had initially approached his assignment with skepticism, expecting to find primitive conditions and ineffective treatments that confirmed conventional assumptions about the colony's limited value. Instead, Jean discovered that colonies focused on terminal care had developed approaches to pain management and psychological support that were far more sophisticated than anything available in conventional medical practice. They had created environments where people could die with dignity, surrounded by community support and spiritual guidance. They had developed protocols for helping families cope with loss and grief that were more effective than the standard religious consolations offered by mainstream institutions. Most remarkably, Jean found that residents of these colonies often lived longer and reported higher levels of satisfaction than comparable patients receiving conventional medical care. The combination of community support, meaningful activity, and acceptance of their condition seemed to provide psychological benefits that translated into improved physical outcomes. Jean's report to royal authorities challenged the assumption that colonies providing end-of-life care were less valuable than those engaged in productive activities. He argued that both types of communities performed essential social functions that deserved official recognition and support. His recommendations helped establish new criteria for evaluating colony applications for autonomous status that considered social and medical contributions alongside economic productivity. The expanded criteria arrived too late to help Sainte-Anne, which had been forced to close in 1454 when their primary benefactor died, and no replacement funding could be found. But the principles Jean articulated influenced policy decisions that protected dozens of other colonies that might otherwise have been abandoned or forcibly closed. The fate of Sainte-Anne's residents illustrates both the vulnerabilities that continued to plague leper colonies and the networks of mutual support that had developed among these communities over decades of shared experience. When it became clear that Sainte-Anne couldn't continue operating, Sister Claire began negotiating with leaders of other colonies to find places for residents who couldn't survive on their own. This process revealed the sophisticated mutual aid networks that had evolved among leper colonies across northern France. Within weeks of Sainte-Anne's closure being announced, offers of sanctuary arrived from colonies as far away as Brittany and Burgundy. Communities that had never had direct contact with Sainte-Anne offered to accept residents, share scarce resources, and provide the specialized care that elderly and severely ill people required. The coordination of this rescue effort was managed primarily by Thomas, the young scholar who had been born at Saint-Julien and had become one of the most effective advocates for colony interests. Using the communication networks that had been developed during the resistance to royal restrictions, Thomas was able to match individual residents with communities that could best meet their specific needs. Master Pierre, an elderly former baker who had spent his final years at Sainte-Anne helping other residents cope with progressive blindness, was accepted by the colony of Saint-Martin near Amiens, which had developed particular expertise in caring for people with vision loss. Sister Margot, who had served as Sainte-Anne's herbalist and healer, found sanctuary at Notre-Dame-des-Champs near Chartres, where her knowledge of medicinal plants complemented their existing medical programs. Most poignantly, Brother François, who had been Sainte-Anne's chaplain and had developed innovative approaches to spiritual counseling for people facing death, was welcomed by 3 different colonies before choosing to join the community at Sainte-Croix near Reims. His decision was influenced by their invitation to help establish a formal program for training spiritual counselors who could serve other colonies facing similar challenges. The successful relocation of Sainte-Anne's residents demonstrated something remarkable about the communities that had emerged from medieval Europe's system of social outcasting. Despite official policies designed to keep them isolated and competitive for scarce resources, these colonies had developed bonds of solidarity and mutual support that transcended geographic boundaries and administrative jurisdictions. But the rescue effort also revealed the precarious nature of even successful colonies' existence. Saint-Martin, which had accepted several refugees from Sainte-Anne, found their resources stretched to the breaking point by the additional residents. Their workshops had to expand production to generate income for more mouths to feed. Their medical facilities became overcrowded, forcing difficult decisions about resource allocation. Their governance systems had to adapt to incorporate new members with different experiences and expectations. Master Robert, who had led Saint-Martin through decades of steady growth and increasing prosperity, found himself confronting challenges he had never anticipated. The colony's careful balance between economic sustainability and charitable mission was disrupted by the sudden influx of people who needed extensive care but couldn't contribute much labor. Their reputation for effective management was threatened by visible signs of strain that might discourage future donors or attract unwanted official attention. Robert's response to these challenges illustrates the innovative problem-solving that had become characteristic of successful leper colonies. Rather than simply trying to absorb the new residents into existing systems, he initiated a comprehensive review of Saint-Martin's operations, seeking ways to adapt their approaches to serve a larger and more diverse population. The review process itself became an exercise in democratic governance that strengthened the community even as it addressed practical challenges. Residents formed committees to examine different aspects of colony life, workshops and economic activities, healthcare and social services, education and spiritual programs, governance and decision-making processes. Each committee included both long-term residents and newcomers from Saint-Anne, ensuring that different perspectives and experiences informed their recommendations. The Workshops Committee, led by Master Antoine, a former carpenter who had lost several fingers to disease but had developed remarkable skill using adaptive tools, discovered that the newcomers brought knowledge and experience that could actually enhance Saint-Martin's economic activities. Master Pierre's expertise in baking techniques led to improvements in bread production that increased both quality and efficiency. Sister Margot's knowledge of herbal medicine created opportunities for Saint-Martin to produce and sell medicinal preparations that were in high demand throughout the region. Most significantly, the committee found that many of the challenges created by Saint-Martin's expansion could be addressed by developing new products and services specifically designed for people with disabilities and chronic illnesses. There was substantial demand for adaptive tools, specialized clothing, and modified furniture that could accommodate various physical limitations. By focusing on this underserved market, Saint-Martin could generate income while providing valuable services to communities throughout northern France. The Healthcare Committee, led by Brother Michel, a former military surgeon who had continued practicing medicine within the colony despite his own advancing illness, identified opportunities to expand Saint-Martin's medical services in ways that could generate income while serving broader social needs. The newcomers from Saint-Anne had brought experience with end-of-life care that complemented Saint-Martin's existing expertise in adaptive medicine and chronic disease management. Michel proposed establishing Saint-Martin as a regional centre for medical training, where physicians and other healthcare providers could learn techniques for treating conditions that conventional medical education ignored. The colony's residents possessed practical knowledge about managing pain, adapting to progressive disabilities, and maintaining quality of life under challenging circumstances that could benefit healthcare providers throughout the region. The Education Committee, led by Master Guillaume, a former university lecturer who had been teaching informally within the colony for years, recognized that the expansion of Saint-Martin's population created opportunities to formalize educational programs that had previously operated on a small scale. The newcomers included people with diverse educational backgrounds and teaching experience who could contribute to a comprehensive curriculum. Guillaume proposed that Saint-Martin establish the first formal school specifically designed for people with disabilities and chronic illnesses. This school would serve not only colony residents, but also people from surrounding communities who had been excluded from conventional educational opportunities because of their physical condition. The curriculum would emphasize practical skills, adaptive techniques, and the kind of collaborative problem-solving that had made leper colonies successful. The Governance Committee, chaired by Sister Anne, a former abbess who had helped develop Saint-Martin's democratic decision-making processes, faced the most complex challenges in adapting existing systems to serve a larger and more diverse population. The informal consensus building that had worked well with a stable population of 50 residents became unwieldy with nearly 80 people, representing different backgrounds and experiences. Anne's committee developed a more formal system of representative governance that maintained democratic principles while improving efficiency. Residents would elect representatives from different constituencies, workshops and economic activities, healthcare and social services, education and spiritual programs, and residential life. These representatives would meet regularly to address routine issues and would convene the entire community only for major decisions that affected everyone. The new governance system also established formal procedures for integrating new residents, resolving conflicts, and maintaining the community's commitment to caring for members who could no longer contribute economically. These procedures reflected lessons learned not just from Saint-Martin's experience, but from the broader network of colonies that had developed similar challenges and solutions over decades of autonomous operation. The implementation of these reforms took nearly 2 years and involved some of the most intensive community organizing in medieval European history. Residents who had never participated in formal planning processes learned to conduct meetings, analyze complex information, and negotiate compromises that balanced competing interests and priorities. The process was not without conflict and frustration. Some long-term residents resented changes to familiar routines and questioned whether newcomers who had contributed nothing to Saint-Martin's success should have equal voice in determining its future direction. Some newcomers felt excluded from informal social networks that had developed over years and questioned whether they would ever be fully accepted as community members. But the conflicts themselves became opportunities for deeper community building as residents learned to address disagreements constructively rather than allowing them to fester or split the community. They developed mediation procedures that drew on the conflict resolution experience of various members, established forums for airing grievances and working towards solutions, and created rituals for celebrating successful collaborations and reconciling after difficult disputes. By 1456, Saint-Martin had emerged from its period of adaptation as a fundamentally transformed community. The colony that had once focused primarily on providing basic care for its residents had become a regional centre for education, healthcare, and economic innovation that served people throughout northern France. Their workshops produced specialised goods that were sought after across Europe. Their medical facilities attracted patients and students from hundreds of miles away. Their school educated children and adults who had been excluded from conventional learning opportunities. Most remarkably, Saint-Martin had demonstrated that communities of outcasts could not only survive sudden expansion and dramatic change, but could use those challenges as opportunities for innovation and growth. The knowledge gained through their adaptation process began circulating through the informal networks that connected leper colonies across Europe, inspiring similar transformations in dozens of other communities. The success of Saint-Martin's transformation attracted attention from unexpected quarters. University scholars began studying their governance systems as examples of democratic organization that might be applicable in other contexts. Church authorities examined their spiritual programs as models for serving marginalized populations. Royal officials investigated their economic activities as examples of successful cooperative enterprises that generated tax revenue without requiring government investment. But perhaps the most significant attention came from other marginalized groups who saw in Saint-Martin's success a model for their own organizing efforts. Communities of disabled veterans, widowed women, orphaned children, and religious minorities began adapting techniques developed in leper colonies to address their own challenges and advocate for their own interests. Master David, a former soldier who had lost his right arm in a battle against English forces and had struggled to find work or support in civilian society, visited Saint-Martin in 1457, seeking advice about organizing a community for disabled veterans. David had heard about the colonies' adaptive workshops and wanted to understand how they had developed techniques for productive work by people with various physical limitations. David's week-long visit became an intensive education in community organization, adaptive technology, and collaborative problem-solving. He worked alongside residents in various workshops, observing how they had modified tools and techniques to accommodate different disabilities. He participated in community meetings, learning how democratic governance systems could function effectively with populations that included people with varying abilities to participate in traditional political processes. Most importantly, David learned about the psychological and spiritual dimensions of successful community building among people who had been rejected by mainstream society. He discovered that Saint-Martin's success wasn't just based on clever adaptations and efficient organization, but on residents' commitment to mutual support, shared purpose, and collective dignity that transcended individual limitations. When David returned to his home region near Calais, he began organizing other disabled veterans using principles and techniques he had learned at Saint-Martin. Within months, he had established a cooperative workshop that produced leather goods and metalwork using adaptive techniques that allowed people with various disabilities to contribute according to their abilities. The workshop provided income and purpose for men who had been reduced to begging after their military service ended. David's success inspired similar efforts by other marginalized groups across northern France. Communities of disabled veterans appeared in several cities, followed by cooperative workshops organized by widows, mutual aid societies established by religious minorities, and educational programs developed by and for people who had been excluded from conventional learning opportunities. These new communities maintained regular correspondence with Saint-Martin and other leper colonies, sharing techniques and strategies while adapting them to their specific circumstances and needs. The informal networks that had originally connected colonies across Europe began expanding to include other marginalized groups, creating an unprecedented system of mutual support and knowledge sharing among society's outcasts. The expansion of these networks had implications that extended far beyond the immediate benefits to participating communities. For the first time in medieval European history, marginalized groups were organizing across traditional boundaries of geography, social status, and type of exclusion. Veterans were learning from lepers, widows were sharing strategies with religious minorities, and disabled people were collaborating with others regardless of the specific nature of their disabilities. This cross-pollination of organizing techniques and community-building strategies accelerated innovation in ways that surprised even the people involved. Solutions developed for one type of challenge often proved applicable to very different situations. Governance systems designed for leper colonies worked effectively in veterans' cooperatives. Economic techniques developed by religious minorities enhanced the sustainability of disability-focused workshops. Educational methods pioneered in one context improved learning opportunities in others. By 1460, this informal confederation of marginalized communities had become a significant social and economic force that could no longer be ignored by mainstream authorities. Their combined economic activities generated substantial tax revenue. Their educational and healthcare services filled gaps that conventional institutions had left unaddressed. Their innovations in governance and organization demonstrated alternatives to traditional hierarchical systems that were attracting interest from reformers within mainstream society. But the very success of these communities created new challenges and tensions that would define the next phase of their development. Official recognition brought opportunities for expansion and legitimacy, but it also brought scrutiny and expectations that might compromise the autonomy that had made their innovations possible. Economic success attracted partners and investors who might not share their commitment to serving marginalized populations. Political influence created temptations to pursue narrow advantages rather than maintaining solidarity with other outcast communities. The choices that leper colonies and their allied communities would make in response to these new opportunities and challenges would determine whether the remarkable experiment in democratic community building that had emerged from medieval Europe's system of social outcasting could survive and thrive in a world that was increasingly willing to recognize its value but might also seek to control and exploit it. The transformation of medieval leper colonies from repositories of social outcasts to centers of innovation and community building represents one of the most remarkable examples of human resilience and creativity in European history. Against all odds and official expectations, people who had been declared legally dead had not only survived, but had created forms of life that challenged fundamental assumptions about social organization, human worth, and the relationship between suffering and wisdom. Their achievements would continue to influence European society long after the medical conditions that had justified their original exile were better understood and more effectively treated. The governance systems they developed would inform democratic movements. Their economic innovations would inspire cooperative enterprises. Their educational methods would influence approaches to inclusive learning. And their healthcare practices would contribute to more humane approaches to chronic illness and disability. Most importantly, their example would serve as a permanent reminder that human dignity and community solidarity can flourish even under the most challenging circumstances, that innovation often emerges from the margins rather than the centers of society. What started as medieval Europe's most brutal system of social exile became something extraordinary. Proof that human dignity cannot be destroyed by legal decree or social rejection. The people declared legally dead had built communities more innovative, more democratic, and more compassionate than the society that cast them out. From Marguerite losing everything in a single morning to Thomas advocating for reform from within the walls that confined him, from Brother Antoine's humiliating quest for arms to Saint Barthélemy's revolutionary chapel rising stone by stone, these stories reveal a fundamental truth about human nature. When stripped of everything except each other, people don't just survive, they create meaning, build beauty, and forge bonds that transcend the cruelest circumstances. The leper colonies evolved from warehouses of despair into laboratories of hope, developing medical innovations centuries ahead of their time, democratic governance systems that challenged royal authority, and economic networks that spanned continents. They proved that worth isn't determined by social status, that innovation emerges from necessity, and that the margins of society often hold its greatest wisdom. Perhaps most remarkably, they demonstrated that legal death couldn't kill the human spirit. People forbidden to live had built lives worth living. Communities designed for isolation had created networks of mutual support. Individuals marked as worthless had proven their immeasurable value. Their legacy reminds us that human dignity exists independent of social recognition, that meaningful community can flourish without official approval, and that those society discards often possess exactly the creativity and resilience that society desperately needs.